Good morning. On behalf of the management team of the King John III Palace Museum of Wilanów, I would like to welcome you all very cordially indeed to this seminar within the project Citri. This is a marvelous meeting dedicated to the gardens of the residents, plus a very important research issue. I would like to welcome Jacek Kuśmierski, a specialist in the area of historic gardens in our museum, Łukasz Przybylak, who is a coordinator at the gardening department in our museum, Bianca Maria Landi, a coordinator of the Boboli Garden in Florence, Paola Ruggieri, coordinator of the architectural heritage of the same garden. Also, I would like to acknowledge somebody who's responsible for the roots and the past conservation of the Boboli Garden, that is Gianni Simonti, the engineer, the gardener of the Boboli Garden. Moreover, I would like to mention Agnieszka Chmielewska, coming from Nieborów. She's the representative of magnificent gardens of Arcadia and Nieborów and Arcadia. And there's also Beata Kańska from Łazienki Królewskie from Warsaw. In 2016, we saw the publication out of the initiative of our museum, a very interesting book by Madam Wrześniak, Professor Wrześniak, Florence, a city museum, the city in the eyes of Polish travelers. This is where we can see beautiful descriptions dating back to the 16th century. This is where a Polish dream of Florence comes out. A dream of Polish travelers who would go there very often in the past. Małgorzata Wrześniak does quote some of them. For example, in 1599, there was Stanisław Grocholski who said Firenze le supera in bellezza. That is, Florence is superb in its beauty. But there were also other guides, for example, one by Maciej Rybocki towards the end of the 16th century, claiming that there are no bigger beauty in the whole Italian territory. And it happens so that Florence and Rome are most frequently quoted ideal cities. I'm referring to the Polish literature. These are cities monument, which constituted important travel destinations, and people would travel there for entertainment, for art, for fruit, and for gardening visions. And this comes as no coincidence that a bouquet of vegetables is called włoszczyzna in Polish culinary tradition, i.e. something that stems from the Italian peoples. Since the times of Bona Sforza, the Queen of Poland and the spouse of Polish king, the presence of Italian vegetables, fruit, have been an obvious thing. And this is also since then, that is, since the 16th century, there have been pages written down and printed dedicated to these connections between Italy and Poland, also revolving around the questions of gardening. Our very museum is, on the one hand, the palace building, plus the adjacent gardens. Those surrounding gardens constitute a superb example of these traditions. This is a tradition in which not only plants are treated seriously, have a space on their own. What also has its space of their own is cuisine, plus recipes that we've investigated into research-wise. We are a complex unit composed of many elements. We've got such projects as Citri and Aurea, and this is beautifully enshrined in the area of the history of feelings and emotions. We are more than delighted to see that the Boboli Garden and the Wilanów Garden are corresponding along these acts of gardening and fruit. And let me remind you that fruit does not only stand for pleasure, delight, but this is also a metaphor and the ability to have imagination. And imagination is something that I would like to wish to all the participants to this seminar. Thank you, and let us see each other on the course of the seminar. The Citri at Aurea project makes me proud, as it sets very much ahead the tradition of prolific exchanges that took place in between Poland and Italy. The exchange was initiated by Cosmo III de' Medici, and thanks to the partnership between the Boboli Garden and the Wilanów Garden, we can reanimate and revive these traditions focused on gardening and the cultivation of citruses. I'm extremely delighted to see this project ongoing, despite these very turbulent times that we need to be confronted with now. Thanks to the use of modern technologies, we can be more we can be closer to each other in order to be able to exchange our views, our competences and knowledge of respective experts coming from our botanical departments. Now we are meeting online, but I wish that we could one day can host this traditional physical exchange. I would like to express and submit the greetings of all the Uffizi gallery personnel to all our colleagues from Wilanów. I would like to greet you all very warmly indeed. Towards the beginning of our seminar, I would like to introduce you to the history and future of the Wilanów citrus collection, which contributed to the launch of the Citri at Aurea project, and so to our today's seminar. The traditions of citrus cultivation in Wilanów date back to the second half of the 20th century. That is, when the owner of the Wilanów residence was King Gianni III. In front of the eastern facade of the palace there was a terraced Italian garden with embroidery ground floors, the direct model of which was the Roman Villa Doria Pamphili. The project was completed by fountains, a complex of gilded sculptures and marble vases. In summer, exotic and Mediterranean plants in pots were displayed in front of the royal seat. In winter, though, they were sent to the orangery, here marked with this red circle, the structure that was located south of the palace's complex. It had a wooden structure on a foundation. This building was quite small. It only occupied 130 square meters, which in itself was an area for approximately 50 plants, depending, of course, on their size. What species did the king cultivate? We don't know exactly. That it is known from historical sources that the collection included mainly pomegranates, myrtles, laurias, jasmines, rosemary bushes, and of course oranges and lemons. It is worth emphasizing that King Jan was an avid gardener. In his library he collected books on gardening and botany, some of which I listed on the slide, the most important ones. Particularly interesting in the context of our project was the work of the Polish naturalist Jan Johnston, in which there are descriptions and engravings showing citrus fruits, known in Europe in the 7th century. Perhaps it was on this basis that he selected his species for his garden. King Jan III imported plants from Italy for the Italian merchant Domenico Componi, but he also received them as a gift. He received one of such gifts in 1684 after the victorious Battle of Vienna from the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo III de' Medici. From the letters of the royal secretary, Tommaso Talenti, it is known that 8 boxes altogether of plants were sent from Florence to Warsaw. Among the mentioned species there are Lumia lemon pomum adami, also known as Adam's apple, peach, walnut, asparagus and fig tree. In addition to the plants requested specifically by the king, others, not known by name, were included. They were also recommended by the Duke's gardeners, and even an Italian gardener was assigned to care for them during transportation. The plants loaded on donkeys travelled 1,600 kilometers en route from Florence to Poland via Bologna, Venice, Vienna, and the Moravian Gate to Krakow. Most likely they got there in May and were sent to Wilanów by the river. The aforementioned lemon Lumia pomum adami was given as a gift at the time of King Jan III as a proof of friendship. But it also had another symbolic dimension. Cypresses came to prominence as a symbol of the mythological Garden Age, and the strength of Hercules, who was to steal golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. This attribute was the object of desire of the rulers of all Europe at that time, which resulted in the creation of Menix and the citrus collection. The title of Polish Hercules accompanied King Jan III throughout his reign, which was also emphasized in his residence in Wilanów. And this was done not only in the architecture of the palace and paintings that can be seen on the slide, but also in the surrounding Baroque garden in the form of a citrus collection. After the death of King Jan, the residence in Wilanów was extended by subsequent owners. The garden and the collection of plants decorating it also changed in the 20s of the 18th century upon initiative of Elżbieta Sieniawska, who was then the richest woman in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. A new orangery was erected. It was 3 times larger than the King's Orangery. The building was designed by architect Giovanni Spazio, and after his death, construction was continued by Giuseppe Giacomo Fontana. The building has become home to an impressive collection of around 300 citrus trees. Thanks to the preserved plant list, we know that among them there were bitter oranges, bergamots, pomelos, citrons, lemons, and probably others that were commonly cultivated in Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania, such as limes, lemons, lilies, mandarins, oranges, and ponceries. As I summed up, you can see that this collection was quite substantial. Thanks to historical records and archaeological excavations, we know that they were cultivated, among others, in 23 faience vases from Delft. Hundreds of their fragments were found in Wilanów during archaeological excavations, while the entire vase is now in the collection of the National Museum in Warsaw. In addition to them, green glazed ceramic pots and oak pots were also used for cultivation. This one is in the collection of our museum. In the mid-18th century, the plant collection was transferred to a new orangery designed by the Saxon architect Johann Sigmund Debel. The building was 100 meters long and 15 meters wide, including over 800 square meter of plant storage space. During the winter, its interior was heated by 6 stoves, fired from a corridor that ran throughout the building. The space of the main hall was filled with orange trees, most probably arranged in 4 rows, from the highest along the north wall to the lowest along the windows on the south side. What was hidden in such a large space? Probably up to 400 trees grown in pots, painted in white and green stripes. We know about their existence thanks to historical descriptions, but also thanks to the wonderful landscapes of the Italian painter Bernardo Bellotto, which can be seen today at the Royal Castle in Warsaw. There is a hypothesis that these characteristic pots were a memento of King Augustus II, who leased Wilanów in the 30s of the 18th century. We would deal here with a very interesting thread of Saxon influence in Polish gardens. However, this thread requires additional research. Unfortunately, later historical changes led to the dispersion and impoverishment of the Wilanów collection. After the revolution of 1790, some of the trees were moved to the palace garden in Weinzut. The old dilapidated orangery was thoroughly rebuilt at the beginning of the 19th century according to the design of the Polish architect Christian Piotr Eigner and then owner of Wilanów Stanisław Kostka-Potocki. The building was shortened. An entrance with Corinthian columns and a new facade with French windows were added. In the mid-19th century, Alexandra and August Potocki rebuilt the orangery. Old stoves were replaced with underfloor heating, and 3 water tanks were installed on the main axis of the hall. The central one was 4 meters in diameter, while the side ones on the right and left were 2 meters in diameter. This space was filled with trees and exotic plants in flower pots, arranged in a free arrangement, and we know this thanks to the descriptions of garden exhibitions organized in the orangery in the mid-19th century. Of course, trees from the times of King Jan III could still be hidden inside. This is indicated by historical descriptions and artifacts, such as hoops on trees. One of them bears an inscription informing that this is the laurel hoop of King Jan III, who was hit by a cannonball during the siege of Warsaw in 1784. In the 19th century, however, cypresses lost their importance. The ancient mythological symbolism of plants was replaced by the desire to learn about them scientifically. Thanks to botanical expeditions and the invention of the Wardian case, collecting exotic plants has become fashionable in Europe. Cypresses still appeared in the palace surroundings, but it is worth noting that they were grown in simple oak pots, which can be seen in historical photos, as these ones. According to historical sources, at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, there were about 200 specimens, involving 20 from the times of King Jan III. And so, as I mentioned, however, new species of exotic plants were more popular. At that time, camellias, peonies, rhododendrons, orocaria and cedars were grown in the Wilanów Orangery. To the north of the orangery, there was an extensive horticultural farm with greenhouses, where new species of plants were grown, such as pitcher plants, date palms, and Royal Victoria, with impressive leaves over 2 meters in diameter. The outbreak of World War II put the final end to the collection of plants. In September 1939, as a result of the shelling of German troops, the orangery and the fig house burned down completely, and the subsequent neglect led to an almost complete loss of the greenhouse resources, which also fell into disrepair. After the war, only the remains of the orangery remained, which later served as the basis for reconstruction. These works were led by a Polish conservator, Stefan Deubel, who restored the overall appearance of the orangery to its former state. Nevertheless, the interior layout was changed, a transverse wing was added, and the roof was covered not with wooden shingles as before, but with sheet metal, following the pattern of the old orangery in Łazienki Królewskie. The rebuilt orangery was intended not for plants, but for the gallery of Polish sculpture of the 20th century. In addition, the main hall has been shortened by 13 meters in favor of the staircase. The gardening in Wilanów was also rebuilt in a new shape, to which exotic plants such as agaves, bougainvillea, banana trees and date palms, which can still be seen in our gardens, have been returning successfully. Citrus trees also appeared, that is, lemons, grapefruits, mandarins and orangeries. Orangery plants also appeared at the show of plants used in Wilanów Gardens in the 17th and 18th centuries, which was organized in 2003 by the Garden Department team led by Ewa Skoneczna and Kamila Domańska. This process of restoring historical resources added a new phase in 2016. This is when 38 specimens of bitter orange trees in oak pots painted with white and green stripes appeared in the Baroque garden, and the containers have been reconstructed on the basis of Bernardo Bellotto's paintings that I showed you earlier. These trees were brought to Wilanów from Sicily, and the special soil for their cultivation was brought from Tuscany. In 2018, I found a story about the transport of plants from Florence to Wilanów, which I mentioned earlier, and thanks to the membership of our museum in the European Group of Historic Gardens, we had the opportunity to establish contact with the Boboli Gardens in Florence. The great kindness and great enthusiasm of a local team enabled us to establish this cooperation between us within the Citri et Aurea project. Its aim is, above all, to broaden the knowledge of Italian-Polish relations in the field of historical citrus collections, but also to rebuild our Wilanów citrus collection. Our friends from the Boboli Gardens are to support us in this project with their expert knowledge as well as experience. We took our first joint activities last year thanks to the funding from the Minister of Culture and National Heritage as the part of the Inspirational Culture Programme. Thanks to the hospitality of our Italian colleagues, we were able to get to know the Tuscan culture of citrus cultivation in almost every aspect. that is, the selection of plant species on the example of the Boboli Gardens collection, Villa di Castello, or the Botanical Garden of the University of Florence, which have their considerable resources in old, very valuable varieties. We also learned the secrets of traditional craftsmanship and methods of making terracotta pots in the Poggi Ugo manufactory in Impruneta. Furthermore, we learned about the production of citrus trees at Oscar's Tintoris nursery in Pesca. And by the way, our colleague, Dr. Anna Chmielewska, conducted a review of documents in the State Archives in Florence, among which she found original letters describing the transport of citrus trees from Florence to Warsaw. All this information combined is to be used to prepare the reconstruction of the historic citrus collection in Wilanów. There is still a lot to do for us, research on the culture of citrus cultivation in Poland and in Wilanów, drawing up a catalogue of historical citrus varieties, developing a list for the Wilanów collection, designing and adapting our orangery to preserving citrus trees, and of course, a successive creation of this collection. Our goal is to recreate the collection, presenting the entire history of the Wilanów collection from the 17th to the 19th century. That is 200 cypress in wooden pots painted in white and green stripes, 24 cypress in glazed vases, and the same number in profile vases, and finally about 70 in natural wooden pots. We do believe that the combination of Italian cypress culture and Polish traditions in Wilanów will ensure the achievement of maximum genuinity of our collection, and thanks to this, it will eventually have two homelands, Italy and Poland. Thank you very much. Orangery Garden in Wilanów History and Perspectives, on the occasion of the Polish-Italian seminar, which we have the opportunity to participate. I would like to outline over 300 years of history of this small garden, as well as outline the prospects for its restoration. The Orangery Garden in Wilanów is absolutely unique. Despite its small size, it is a garden that crystallized the desires of its successive owners, the ambitions of the next major gardeners who held their offices, and also reflected the stylistic changes in the history of garden art in Europe. It is not without reason that I begin my presentation by showing you graphics depicting lemon, orange and fig branches, because it is the buildings that we use to cultivate these plants that are directly related to the wandering of the Orangery Garden through space and time. This 300-year journey is divided into three main chapters. The first chapter is, of course, the period of Jan III Sobieski's patronage and the construction of an orangery garden in the southern part of the Wilanów residence. In fact, today, as to the shape of the orangery garden and the area of King Jan III, there are mainly scientific conjectures supported by scraps of archival information. On the other hand, by comparing this information and general architectural trends in the 17th century Europe, it is highly likely that the orangery garden was a garden of plants grown directly in the ground, which were periodically covered with a wooden structure. So, for the winter, the structure was erected and disassembled in spring. Here, for example, we have an orangery from Hortus Palatinus in Heidelberg, Germany. The second extremely important chapter in the history of the orangery garden in Wilanów is a chapter written by Elżbieta Sieniawska and August II the Strong, who elevated the orangery garden to the rank of an ornamental garden. Despite numerous archival sources documented the condition of Elżbieta Sieniawska's garden, as well as relics excavated during archaeological excavations, we are not entirely sure what this garden of Elżbieta could look like. Nevertheless, its space was defined by Elżbieta's new investment, i.e. the construction of a new orangery. This new orangery wasn't built at the height of the south wing of the palace, so the garden was divided into two parts. The southern part was stretched between the new orangery and the fig house. It was an almost utility garden. In turn, the northern part of the orangery and the palace was the decorative part. We know from written sources that the special composition of this garden was built by two embroidered ground floors, which were properly planted with boxwood and lavender. But we are not able to accurately indicate the ornamentation of these ground floors from the times of Elżbieta Sieniawska, only from the later period. The unique decoration of the orangery garden was a souvenir from the times of Jan III Sobieski, emphasizing the main axis of the garden in the form of a globe terrestris. Globus terrestris was a terrestrial globe depicting in then geographic knowledge based on a marble plinth, which in fact also had its twin brother in the northern part of the residence in the form of the globus terrestris representing the night sky. We can see the reconstruction of such elements, be it, for example, at Le Palace in the Netherlands, where globus terrestris is an element of the local water system. And the third chapter, the most dynamic one, extremely complex, in which the threads of all subsequent owners of the Wilanów residence intertwine, also a chapter that continues to this day and in which the future of the Orangery Garden in Wilanów is also embedded and is directly related to the location of the garden in the northern part of the residence. The first subsection of this story is a very interesting period of the lease of the Wilanów estate by August, the second in which he planned the garden in this form. This is how you can see a garden that does not resemble a traditional orangery garden at all. But on the contrary, it serves everything that should be held in hiding, that is, court games, as well as theatre plays in a garden theatre. As a matter of fact, this points to the center of gravity of August's strongest interest in the orangery collection, which he moved in Warsaw to the vicinity of the Saski Palace, while in Wilanów there was a small part of his huge collection of plants. It can be said that it was a very modest deposit. A real breakthrough in the history of the orangery was brought about by the patronage of Zofia and August Czartoryski, who made a new investment to build a huge orangery building. The building was framed on the south side with a garden consisting of two parts, a decorative one and a usable part. The decorative part of this garden was concentrated in the symmetry axis of the building and was in the form of a decorative earth ramp directly adjacent to the southern facade of the orangery, on which a significant part of then a huge collection of exotic plants was presented, and two long floors with an indentation in the southern part, in the borders of which were also placed lanes of cypress. Attention is also drawn to the utility garden plots, located in the eastern and western parts of the garden, which also displayed plants that were the actual pride of the owners of the time, exotic fruit bushes and melons. The end of the 18th century and the investments of Izabela and Stanisław Lubomirski also showed changes in the tendencies in the garden art of Europe at that time, because we can point out that the decorativeness of this garden at that time was slightly simplified compared to the previous state. Also thanks to the new investment in the form of the construction of gardening located behind the orangery, we can observe that these arable areas have largely disappeared from the garden. The way of displaying citruses is partially revealed to us by the painting of Bernardo Bellotto, in which we can observe that the long floors, in this case of the upper garden, were used for the laid presentation of bucket plants in this case, and they are alternately arranged citrus trees and formed laurels. The beginning of the 19th century, and the period of great landscape rearrangement, commenced by Stanisław Kostka-Powocki, was also the time that left its mark on the composition of the orangery garden. The citrus collection was very impoverished at that time, which also mirrors the condition of the orangery garden itself. On the other hand, though, the condition of this garden, i.e. a significant simplification of its composition, also indicates a change in the scope of horticulture interests in the cultivation of exotic plants. The beginning of the 19th century was the time when gardeners chilled not only with the cultivation of citrus plants, but also cherished exotic plants, including groundwater ones. Hence, in the orangery garden of the beginning of the 19th century, you can already observe the strictly exhibition parts in the western part, which served at least to exhibit the gardening skills of gardeners working in Wilanów greenhouses. This tendency to use the orangery garden in Wilanów as a show garden continued also in the first half of the 19th century. Here we can observe the composition of this garden arranged with the participation of Henryk Marconi, and we've got a very clear layout, from which it is actually read that it was a composition for admiring the grand plants growing in this part. Furthermore, we can see a significant reduction in the Wilanów Conservatory, which also indicated a significant decline in the citrus collection, as well as a complete shift of the focus of interest in the cultivation of exotic plants in favor to palm and ground plants. The second half of the 19th century and the patronage of Aleksandra Potocka still indicates its use as a show garden in the case of the Orangery Garden. The long-awaited structure appeared in its space in the form of water, in the form of a fountain, which also determined the later transformation of this garden. The garden of the second half of the 19th century at the Orangery in Wilanów is also a time when the garden is separated from the regular visiting routes, and an additional fee was charged for visiting the garden. This allows us to treat this garden as something like a garden centre, where the residents of Warsaw, as well as adepts of garden art, not related to the Wilanów residents, could come and see what was currently fashionable and promoted by Wilanów gardeners. The turn of the 19th and 20th centuries and this patronage of the Branicki family, is still the continuation of the tradition of the Orangery Garden in Wilanów as a show garden for ground plants and exotic plants, i.e. palms and no longer cypresses, with a continued tendency to exclude this garden from a regular sightseeing route for an additional admission fee. An actual breakthrough, one could say shocking one in terms of composition, was introduced in the 1930s. This is when, thanks to Beata and Adam Branicki, and with their design, participation of Zygmunt Helwig and Zbigniew Strauss, the first garden of contemporary perennials in Poland was arranged next to the Orangery. It was a garden that used a 19th century fountain in the central part, around which a small intender was arranged, and perennial plants were arranged in cascade around this intender. This is one of a few photos showing this perennial garden at that time. It was still a garden excluded from the regular tour, and so an additional entrance fee had to be paid. The garden in this modernist shape functioned until August 1939. In September 1939, as a result of artillery fire, the Wilanów Orangery and fig houses were destroyed, which sort of brutally but also shows this cause and effect relationship between the existence of the cubature of the fig houses and the orangery and the accompanying garden. This garden also ceased to exist altogether, unfortunately. Priceless trees have disappeared from the ruins of the orangery and the fig house. According to the archival records from the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, the Wilanów fig house contained plants from the times of King Jan III, including one of the oldest vines in Poland. This was the landscape of the garden with the fig house and the garden of the Orangery Park. And in fact, it functioned in this state until the 1950s. The Orangery Garden was also found in this very condition in 1942 by Professor Gerard Ciolek, who undertook the restoration of this garden. As a result of Ciolek's design, as well as a result of the reconstruction of the new Orangery building, which was no longer an orangery, and the construction of a fig house, a new garden unit was created, completely detached from its original purpose. Professor Gerard Ciolek designed a contemporary sculpture garden here, and so he invited eminent sculptors of that period to cooperate with him. We can mention Ksawery Donikowski, Henryk Konia, and Alina Szapocznikow. Also, in the central part of the Orangery Garden, modernist sculpture were grouped around the fountain. In the western part, near the fig house, there were sculptures and perennial plants in a bold and aggressive composition. This is what the Orangery Garden looked like when it was commissioned in 1961 as a garden of contemporary sculpture. We can see that the 19th century fountain has been preserved in the central part. It also underwent numerous transformations, even later, however. All the time these works included the preservation of the original outline of this object, which is very interesting because it has a special shelf for growing plants in the coastal zone. During the professor's lifetime, there was another rearrangement of the Orangery Garden in Wilanów. The entire modernist sculpture was taken from Wilanów and transferred to the National Museum in Warsaw, a branch in the Palace of Królikarnia. In turn, the western part of the garden, the fig house, also changed its shape gaining a more subdued stylistically form, supplemented with a completely new water element. This is the form of a garden roughly working as of today. We try to maintain this space around the orangery as a space that is still a kind of pride of gardeners working in Wilanów, in which they show their artistry not only in composing plant arrangements, but also in producing seasonal plants, because we also produce them in Wilanów. So today it can be said that the surroundings of the Wilanów Orangery and the flower and arrangement of the Orangery Garden in Wilanów have a floral setting that it did not have in its entire post-war history. This is what makes us really work now, can be said, on a white sheet in black, as Gerard Ciołek once did. The conservation assumptions for the restoration of the Orangery Garden in Wilanów were actually formulated for us by themselves. They were delineated by all the numerous historical layers that in this space once existed or still exist. Importantly, we wanted to maintain this historic layout of both gardens, that is the central part of the conservatory and the garden by the Vic House. It was also important for us to preserve the layers in the form of invaluable, in this case, considering the scale of destruction of the preserved fountains and fences in the eastern part, which date back to the 19th century. It was also important for us to keep the intender and the arrangement of the quarters designed by Gerard Ciołek, giving them a slightly more new-styled outline. It was also vital to open the garden on the south side of the so-called Vaulted Avenue, whose name actually appeared in the first half of the 19th century and the 1950s, was on the map. It was signed by Hunter's Vaulted Avenue. It was crucial to separate the garden visually from the eastern side. In this case, formed arcade lanes were used. Moreover, we consider it justified in the entire history of the dynamics of transformations of the Vic Garden to restore it to the form from the first half of the 19th century, i.e. the form of a show garden in which there will be a huge seasonal and perennial flower beds. A significant part of the entire process of revitalization of an orangery garden is also conservation and adaptation of the accompanying buildings. In this case, at the Vic House, we will be trying to conserve the rooms accompanying the historic gate, and this is for the purpose of creating a permanent plant sale point. However, the culmination of this process, or the culmination depending on how the economic issues are arranged, will be the adaptation of the interior of the orangery to its original function, that is, the display of citrus plants, and this is what I hope, which I hope we will recreate thanks to the Citri area project. All these conservation assumptions led us to the creation of such a concept of the revalorization of the former Orangery Garden in Wilanów, which combines all historically documented layers with an adaptation to the needs of the display of the restored citrus collection. In such a indentation in the central part of the Orangery Garden, we plan to exhibit 72 citrus plants from the reconstructed Wilanów collection in the future. Finally, I would like to thank you very much indeed for your attention and invite you to visit with this positive, and I hope, accent and a closer or further perspective of the garden restoration. Thank you. Good morning, my name is Bianca Maria Landi. I'm the coordinator of the Boboli Garden in Florence. As the representative of the Uffizi gallery, I'm here together with the architect Paola Ruggieri and Gianni Simonti. On behalf of the three of us, we would like to give away our greetings to you, representatives of the Jan III Museum, for all this tremendous work that you have provided us with in these difficult times, whereby we are restricted by the pandemic to maintain physical distance, which does not shatter the spirit of mutual cooperation, something that is the leading force in our day-to-day life. And this spirit that we had in this Citri and Aurea project, this is a project of a fundamental value from the perspective of the life of our gardens. This project has now turned its second anniversary. It has been the result of the exchange of practices, knowledge, and it's also due to the fact that our gardens belong to the European route of historic gardens. Both our institutions are in this set network. Just to be able to grasp the identity of a historic garden, this is a complex task. We know that we are dealing here with much of dynamics concerning the very many components of a garden. This very matter is never static. We need a research which is ongoing, but we also need some experience, and also we need to be able to integrate knowledge of many people, many specialists. What also matters here is this sensual dimension, emotional dimension of such a being as a garden. Just to be able to have this work of thought, and we do it because we are privileged to coordinate this garden every single day, and so we can trace these main concepts that guide our thoughts. We refer here to such motives as time or order, which is contrary to chaos. Chaos is something characteristic of subsequent elements of a garden, and the order, which is about the structure and about the thought of the designer. There comes also into play such motives as growth or evolution. And here we need to have this historical reference, what the garden looked like in the past, what were the factors that determined the shape of the garden. We need to take care of the garden, and we need to do it every day. We need to do it knowing in depth the sensitivity of a garden. As we stressed beforehand, the garden is something very complex in nature, and in this light we could pose ourselves three questions. These questions can guide us to grasp this very identity of a historic garden. At the end of the day, these questions could give us answers why certain botanical elements there are here in the garden, what was the purpose of it, and what are historic gardens characterized with. I would have these questions verbalized in this way. Where do we come from, where are we now, and where we are heading? When it comes to question number one, where do we come from? Here we can have this discussion around this real roots of the garden. These roots date back to 1550. This is a year when Eleanor of Toledo and Cosimo I decide to buy a plot behind the Palazzo Pitti. This used to be the Pitti garden. It served the purpose to extend the space behind the palace. They wanted to have a garden that would be corresponding to the magnificence of the palace itself. But on the other hand, it was also for this space to be of use. That is, it should have been a space to respond to very concrete needs of the court life, of the palace life. So, this is why such varieties were grown. And therefore, also there was this interest, an early interest in the concept of biodiversity. And there was a number of different species and varieties. All these plants found their place in the Boboli Gardens. If we want to go through this topography of the garden, they will help us immensely in grasping what the actual evolution of the Boboli Garden looked like. On this basis, we'll be able to see how this original project was enriched with the passage of time. As early as on the image of Giusto di Utens, which dates back to 1599, 1602, this is where we see the geometric elements of the garden, regularities of the garden. That was the concept that Leonor and Cosma came up with. These schemes of trees were supposed to set regularities in the garden structure. This is where we dealt with this rectangular scheme. All the plots, all the schemes later translated into enriching the structure of the garden. And we had also very many platans, beech trees and others. So that was a kind of polychromic aspect of the garden. Plus, there was a cultivation of many different plants serving the court life. Among them, we could find not only vegetables, but also varieties that could be of advantage to pharmacotherapy. Cosma was indeed a passionate of botanics. He was also very much into the possibilities of use of given agents in Boboli cultivated plants. So this makes it apparent how benevolent and long-thinking towards his peoples was Cosma the First.
Il giardino in un certo senso quindi riportava già un po' il senso della
This garden reflects the diversity of nature, which was also grasped in the scriptures of Eleanor of Toledo. This 16th century core that you could see in the previous plants evolved also when it comes to its overall surface. During the reign of Cosma II, the space changed. Adding to this, the complexity of the garden grew when it comes of all the various forms that we could trace in the garden back then. This is where we see a significant extension in surface. The garden went beyond the walls, defensive walls during the war between Florence and Siena. This is the total of additional 30 hectares that were added up. The design of this garden in 18th century was assigned to Parigi and Almichini. This is where the second perspective arcs came into being, the Avenue of Cypresses. The avenue that led to the amphitheatre, to the statue, and to the Belvedere Hill. This is yet another arch which accompanies the perspective towards the Roman gate. This served the purpose for the scenographic accents to be ever more exhibited, ever more foregrounded. So the identity of the garden gains on value. The history of the garden is very long. Time passes. Here we have jumped at upcoming years, upcoming ages, two major transformations of the gardens. An important change under the Lorraine rule, 1843. The whole portion of the labyrinths that were once planted in the 16th century get destroyed to make space to have a road developed. And so you see what this surface looks like now. This extension within 30 hectares constitutes the green lungs of Florence, in the very heart of Florence. And now you can easily imagine what kind of a role this kind of a space has to play, especially in the context of the urban life. Moreover,
rimanda appunto a quelle tre domande direttrici della nostra riflessione che ci siamo fatti.
All the things lead us back to the three questions that we raised at the beginning of this presentation. We were looking at the most important motives. There is this motive of time. The motive of time does accompany all of this reflection. So time enriches the complexity of the garden. It boosts it. So this constitutes a kind of framework, but this is a framework which does not inhibit, which does not hinder the growth. Furthermore, time allows to have more dimensions in place of sensoric or emotional nature. Let me quote Goya: El tiempo también pinta, which means that time paints by itself. So this is the kind of force that provides a given unit with a pattern, but it does not create an artwork that matches one to the canons of a standardized beauty. Here, what we take into consideration is the botanical collections. They find their brilliant expression in our garden. They require amusement and they require care. They date back in the past which matters a lot to us, irrespective of the fact that this is a very remote past. What are we departing here from? We are departing from the Medici family. The Medici family were interested in the collections of plants. All began with Cosma I, then came Cosma II, and his son Leopold, Duke Leopold, who was also a great collector. He dealt with many areas, and this was also under the rule of Ferdinand II. This is where the Galileo Galilei Institute found its place. The core of some plant collections that we take care of now date back to the Medici rule. The 19th century matters a lot here. The botanical collections, which can be expressed via citrus collections that come from the Medici time. My colleague Gianni Simonti is going for sure to go more in depth in this area. Here we see that this interest in botanical questions go also to other species, to other cultivations, to other crops that can be done within a garden. And of course citruses here play the most prominent role. which is also something of European prominence. We've got a collection spanning through 500 plants, 60 varieties, among which 30 can be traced back to the Medici house, but there are also other plant collections, be it roses. We've got a total of 156 species and varieties of roses. Some of those roses are species of varieties that can be traced back to the scriptures of the Medici times. Nevertheless, the actual core of this collection are inventories and lists coming back to the 19th century. The rose collection does embellish our garden. You've got here this night garden. These are spaces which makes it ever more beautiful, especially in some seasons of the year. Next to it, we've got other plant collections. These plant collections are very characteristic. For example, aquatic plants, swamp plants. This is what we also steward together with our partner. We've got the total of 50 varieties of water lilies, 10 varieties of lotus flower. So, the collections of aquatic plants and their very presence can be traced back to the 19th century scriptures. Del circuito del Museo di Storia Naturale, il circuito della Specola a Firenze. When we started being functioning within the structure of the Museum of Natural History, the whole collection was also later enriched by other varieties, be it also hybrid varieties, and they are precious and priceless from the perspective of our visitors as well. Together with the Botanical Garden, we administer tropical and subtropical plants. We've got 100 specimens, around 10 species and varieties of palms. Their core is the lists that were developed in the 19th century. So, bearing in mind the very complexity of this sport, nella seconda metà del Settecento lo vedeva destinato come uno spazio which was supposed to be as early as the 19th century for the cultivation of vegetable plants, together with the tropical plants, of which there was a number. They soon became a touristic magnet for the city. Filippo Parlatore, a Palermitan gardener, took over the administration over this place from the Museum of Natural History. He organized the protection of this place in accordance with the rules of geographic cultivation of plants. So here we see a huge diversity in this garden. We've got a collection of swamp plants, aquatic plants, we've got hortensias, we've got peonies, bush peonies, English roses, or 19th century hybrid varieties. So, circa 40 varieties. These are trees and bushes stemming from many different spots in the world. Di Boboli che costituisce per propria matrice anche per l'idea originaria di fatto un giardino dentro il giardino e che però richiama
So this is in practice a garden within a garden.
Spinta verso la ricerca.
This place is also a point of departure for our research, for our dissemination works. Moreover, we are here as the employees of the garden. We are spokespeople for these values, for this immense value that this very garden demonstrates. In the Boboli Garden, we also cultivate an unlimited number of camellias. We've got around 30 varieties, 45 specimens. Everything dates back to purely catalogues of 1818. There are further inventories coming back to the first half of the 19th century. This garden, aside from its proper botanical collections, houses green architecture and green architectural forms.
Fondante del giardino di Boboli e che richiedono di essere curate e mantenute ben leggibili come un elemento assolutamente caratterizzante l'identità del giardino. E mi riferisco, come si può anche vedere nell'immagine che ci accompagna, alle cerchiate, la cerchiata grande e la cerchiata piccola, che sono queste strutture risalenti già alla prima metà del 1600, create dall'intreccio di questi rami di leccio allevati proprio in modo tale da creare una sorta di tonnel verde che volutamente accompagnava la visuale e contribuiva appunto a quell'enfasi geometrica e prospettica a cui ci riferivamo prima nella descrizione del viottolone dei cipressi, ma ancora ragnaie, le strutture tipiche non solo del giardino di Boboli, ma anche di altri giardini di ville medicee.
Next to the botanical collections, what is also very important are green architectural forms. These forms come to reflect the very design of this garden. These forms have to be managed also, and this is a very characteristic element as far as the identity of the garden is concerned. Here I could also refer to these slides. You can see what I'm referring to this green tunnel, a small one, a big one, and these are all the structures which make us think of the first half of the 16th century when they were developed, and they were to have this visual of a green tunnel. They were to mirror the geometrical shapes of the garden, something that was also visible in other elements. There comes also the so-called ragnaie, something characteristic not only of the Boboli Garden but also of other villas, the Medici family, coming from the Renaissance time. So there is this interplay between full space, empty space, and there is light and shade. There are islands of green fields. This is all very irregular, also pertaining to this very planting. So all these forms had to play a very practical function, something that would evoke the court life.
Oggi siamo in un momento in cui il giardino vede un grande flusso di visitatori.
There are espaliers, which also speaks to the geometry of the garden. Then we've got avenues and alleys with trees. This is something that we have to also bear in mind. Within the insides of the garden and with the passage of time, one had to also take into consideration the aspects pertaining to security of visitors. One had to adjust to the aspect of security all the interventions that were planned. One had to respond to how the trees and plants evolve and what's the purpose of the very space. Now, moving forward, when it comes to our reflection around the identity of the garden, when it comes to these three leading questions which have led us throughout my presentation. On this spot, let me refer to the question, where do we come from, to the question, where are we now? We are now at a moment in time in which within the garden we see an ever-increasing influx of visitors. They are engaged people. They are well
oriented, well aware of the history of the garden, peculiarities of the garden, all relative of its history. And simultaneously, what we have to take into consideration is the need to have a restoration interventions and protection, and also to make the garden ever more valuable. Some examples pertaining to the major tissues of the garden, be it plant tissue, plant architectural tissue and the sculpture tissue. These are inextricably all interwoven parts. These are spirits of the garden that are married with each other. They are integrated, one with the other, and this becomes apparent from the very early beginnings of the functioning of the garden. Now we can see the Cypress Avenue, which constitutes one of the main perspective axes of the garden. This is a carrier of the primary characteristics of the first design of this garden. After the transformations which took place in the 7th century, we can see it in evident measures. We see two pillars, two espaliers of cypresses. Here, the distance in between all the trees is well measured. We've got three so-called Florentine arms, which are an equivalent of 1 meter 70 centimeters. Here we see the kind of grid, and that those grids are very irregular, kept in a regular way, so this regularity has been maintained. And also now we are working to have it in place, and we would wish to start off a new process of conservation that will take place in the Cypress Avenue.
Abbiamo lavorato anche su altri aspetti piuttosto peculiari dal punto di vista botanico, che erano ancora tracce di un...
And of course, during this evolution, we needed to have some losses, which are also down to extreme weather conditions. It is also a very important aspect in the context of administering historic gardens. This is a kind of perspective or variable that you have to take into account. You have to think that there is a variable that you can't envisage. Weather is of essence, to cut the long story short here. And there are these pictures where I see exactly that. The effects of a storm that took place in October 2018. It was enough to have a few minutes of this incident for us to bear losses of multi-centurial trees from the Cypress Avenue. The result was that we needed to take up actions to restore the diversity of this avenue. Furthermore, we worked on other aspects which are very interesting from the point of view of the botanic tissue. On this occasion, we read also very important traces of this primary design, i.e. mazes or labyrinths that were destroyed, that were dismantled in the 19th century for a road to be able to be accommodated. In the evolution of this garden, we could not have a full restoration of the labyrinths. Nevertheless, on this map we can see the actual geometry. Where did they lead to? And this is again a very important component of the identity of the garden. Our task is also to take proper care of these labyrinths. Our task is to attempt that these traces are kept visible. This is a place where in the past we had an intervention of restoration of the very interiors of the labyrinth. This is a so-called musical room. This is where we introduced very precious artworks of contemporary art. This is where they were exhibited,
Due to interventions that were set to examine the stability of the soil, we need to have this security buffer for the growth of the plants. Here the density of the plantings was limited. Here it was also necessary to have new plants of oaks. What were the criteria that we adopted here? Of course, we did not have to think about the proper rebuilding of the labyrinth. Such an approach would not have been proper. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, we were trying to strike balance between what new plants need, that is, they need to grow, but on the other hand, we had to bear in mind these old Goris planimetries, these old plants. Therefore, we wanted to have these grids inserted in a way for the density to be smaller, vis-à-vis to what we had in the past, but at the same time we could maintain this stability, and you can see the overall effects. We've got young plantings and the older trees. So we've got three components intimately entwined with each other. That is this botanical tissue, which is mixed up within architecture. It is surrounded by architecture, and there comes also into play a magnificent sculpture part, which in itself is very valuable. In order to be able to take care of this kind of institution, you have to have a team, and in a team you have to be able to confront your vision, your ideas from many points of view, from many perspectives. And so I would like to hand over to Paola Ruggieri. She's an architect, and she's going to shed some more light on some of the conservation interventions that have just been executed or are now in the pipeline. These are all interventions or tasks which are concentrated on this architectural tissue. Good morning, my name is Paola Ruggieri. I'm an architect, and after this magnificent presentation of my colleague Bianca Maria Landi, I would like to take the floor to tell you a few words about and this is going to be within the framework of this international dialogue, a few words about the aspect referring to the Italian garden. The Boboli Garden offers an example which is in itself very interesting. It is something also very complete. This is a complete representation of the Italian garden. Why does it happen so? In this reality in which we function every day, in which we do our research, in this reality whereby we do our interventions, protecting this very important historical, cultural and natural heritage of sculpture too. This is where we look at the garden as a place where there are contact points, intersections of very many traces, and these carriers of meaning come from the very first idea. And this can be associated with the concept of the Italian gardens. We are talking about the topics that are interrelated between each other from the perspective both of this original project and the current use of this beautiful garden. One of the most important aspects regarding the Italian garden is the topic of the secret garden.
Here in the Boboli Garden, we can see such secret gardens, hidden gardens, and in accordance to their guiding concept, they are not free to public, they are not available to public. This is something reserved and excluded for the sole entertainment and use of the families reigning over Florence. Now a handful of information about the Camellias garden. This is a fantastic example of the hidden garden, which was set up upon decision of Prince Matthias, minor brother of Ferdinand, and Duke Ferdinand. It was conceived as some place for the exclusive use of the Medici family. Later came their successors, so the Lorraine family. So it was the kind of back office to this court, also under the Lorraine rule. This garden, as we can see, is very closely located to the Pitti Palace. In the first slide we can see the topographic plan. There is also the marking of the Pitti Palace on it, and here we see this slot of land where there is the plan of the Camellia Garden. These drawings have been stored in the Central Archive in Prague. This is where the archive of the Lorraine house was delivered. Here we can see in all precision what the contours, what the outlines of this garden looked like. This is a design that was developed in Indian ink, most surely manufactured by Massimo Puccianti, and it was managed by the Supreme Administration of Florence. So in the beginning, this garden that was born to life had a different layout pertaining to this vertical structure. The altitudes were not apt for the cultivation of camellias. Rather, other plants were thought of, like tulips, but in the course of later changes, conversions under Lorraine house, the garden found itself in a totally different place, with different exposure characteristics. So it became a shaded spot, so it was more valid for the cultivation of camellias, and so we can find this information in the historic documentation. We find traces about about blossoming trees, and therefore we can assume the thing was about camellias. So the 19th century camellias are quoted here many times in later scriptures. Now, when it comes to this, it accentuates yet another very important motive. Here we are referring to something yet another of a characteristic value for the Italian garden, that is the cave. The cave is also indirectly associated with the topic of water. The cave is something very close to the designers of the Medici family, and this cave is a mark which cements the communion between the natural and the artificial elements. There is this intersection between water and stone. This is of indissoluble nature. This is a passerby cave. This cave was designed to the concept of a cover, in a way to draw the attention, or as we know that the Boboli Garden is awash with such architectural structures. This is what we know very well, be it the cave of Buontalenti, the Grotto of Madame. These are architectural forms within which water and stone go together. They go to be linked indissolubly. This is where also fountains come into play. Their function has not always been restored, but due to various mechanisms, interventions which can be associated with this entire water machinery. There's one example that I would like to share with you from this Camellia Garden. There's this correspondence of the present and the past. Recently, we have concluded the process of restoration and conservation of this garden of camellias. Now it is closed for the public due to the risk which originated in unstable walls, external walls, and nevertheless we want to relaunch works as soon as possible so that it can be also enjoyed by the public, by the visitors. There is yet another example. Here I would like to draw your attention to this image presenting yet another part of the garden, coffee house. The coffee house view of Lamberti coming from 1783, it was restored in the National Library in Florence. This is yet another part of the Boboli Garden, caught here in this image, and this image exhibits the stages in a very interesting evolution of the garden. A 16th century garden converted in the Italian garden. Now it has become the enterprise of the Lorraine family. This particular coffee house is located under the fortress, under the western northern fortress. As we see now in this slide, i.e. we are referring to both perspectives of now and the past one. In the 18th century, the function of the garden was changed, and it was made dependent on the existence of this coffee house. It is a fairly interesting project that was done upon the wish of the Grand Duke Leopold. It was supposed to be a place for resting of the members of the family, for the people who would wish to taste chocolate in its interiors. So the externals change once the building has popped up. Here on the hill we've got the building of the coffee house, and now this entire design has been converted. Now there are other finishing touches, other finishing elements, be it one, the fountain of Ganymede. So there is this building of the fountain and the fountain of Ganymede. So we've got two ending points of this particular perspective. The example that I've given you is the example which is very relevant. Relevant also in this context when we talk about such motives, time perspectives, the past, now and the future. In 2018, after plentiful research, Galleria Uffizi started restoration works, and now we have managed to finish off the conservation of the green parts, and this is what was stewarded by Bianca Maria Landi. Equally, we have concluded the restoration of the elements of the water system. That is this small cave, which is located at the heart of this small staircase, and you can see it in the front of the coffee house. This was also a very interesting project that took into consideration starting off a few hundreds of new fountain elements, and the actual fountain of Ganymede was put to function again, and the cave is the crowning of this intervention. The fountain was made subject to conservation that did not only include the restoration of sculptures, but went more deeper to accommodate subterranean elements. whereby we've got also this tank reservoir serving the fountain. So the original function was restored. So now we can enjoy the effects of conservation interventions which have just come to conclusion. Now, speaking of our experiences when we exchange it, it is also worthwhile mentioning that we have just had the tender for the restoration of the coffee house, and we are hopeful that this process will be started soon, and so we'll be able to restore the possibility to use this very important architectural element. Now moving on to another slide. Here we see the Neptune pond, the pond of Neptune. So by this we are coming back to this leading theme of our presentation, that is the Italian garden, Giardino all'Italiana. This is something that is very much based on water. And we can see and we can say that water is this element which was immensely helpful for designers, for the creators of this garden. It was the element that helped to create a proper scenographic framework when it comes to actual utilities of this place. Now, the pond of Neptune, great surface, depth of 3 meters, that's the second pond of the Boboli Gardens. And we know that ponds constitute large water reservoirs serving the garden. For a garden to be able to be operational, we need just sufficient amounts of water. So from the very beginning, we have been observing problems concerning the use of water. Water used to be and is still now a very precious resource. In terms of these infrastructural elements, we can talk about most sophisticated, most refined art of engineering. So there's this pond. The second one, the first one was located where we've got now the cave of Buontalenti. The water from the Ginevra source was the source feeding the water system serving the purposes of the palace. Another pond. This pond used to be called the Great Pond, the rectangular pond. It used to serve as the water reserve, and later it was also the fish pond. The fountain that we see, it is now located elsewhere. It used to be located elsewhere than what we see now, and it is also down to interventions and that were in the course in the 18th century. This location dates back to the beginning of 17th century. Why am I quoting this example? Today, this Neptune pond is also being the subject of research, and we are going to have conservation interventions in this place as well. At that stage, we are soon to start a very important project, a research project that would take advantage of most modern technologies, that is photographic examination and laser scanner. And this research is going to give us, provide us with data. On the basis of this data, we'll be able to have in course the interventions of restoration and the rebuilding of the pond. This data will also enable us to renew the water gardens, and water gardens would be once a very significant part of this entire pond ensemble. Yet another thing to be mentioned. Next picture, there is this view over the Neptune fountain by Lamberti, the year 1784. This is also where we see a place undergoing very many changes. In the first place, this pond was rectangular. Later, under the Lorraine rule, it took up a totally different shape. As Bianca Maria Landi mentioned, this Lamberti arch opens up to the pond, then over the Pitti Palace, and there are also landscape axes. And this statue used to be an allegory of peace, affluence, wealth of Tuscany under the rule of Frederick II. Next pictures that draw our attention in the first place to the monument of Neptune that was once the subject of conservation, and these elements were being renewed, and now there are fountains which are now not operational, are going to be renewed as well. From the 16th century we jump to the 17th century, to this Isle Pond. This is also another fish pond of significant dimensions, 670 square meters, 4.5 meters deep, so this is again a very substantial water reservoir, and it was its original function as well. And also today, this is a place to use in this way. Now, having in mind the need to use water, given climate change and given different varying temperatures, we need more water now because of that. And this trend goes on. Nevertheless, this is also for us something very important from the point of view of water supplies, or the supplies of all the caves that find themselves within the garden. This is this Isle Pond that we see it from the perspective of Lamberti. It is something very similar to what we have in historic records. In this case, the pond was made subject to important interventions, very comprehensive in nature, that pertain both to architecture and sculptures, and also to green areas. It let us restore the regular functioning of all fountains that are a distinguishing feature of this pond. We see here another view. This view provides us with an overall image of how this design gets represented in practice, something that is supposed to evoke the intersection between architecture, green and water and sculpture. These are all components which matter a lot. As we can see in the incisions from the 19th century, there is this image of the fountain with ocean. This is when all this fountain functioned. This is a very important challenge that we needed to accept. This is not an easy task. We need to deepen our knowledge and provide for further research. And we hope that the very functioning of all these systems can be restored within the ponds, within the Isle Pond in this case. And for years now, these systems have not been operational, as inhabitants of Florence have already been accustomed to seeing them not working, but this is our overarching goal for them to restore their function, and this is a very important element of the plan that we have for the years to come. And this is a very important part of the entire Boboli Garden. I'm taking floor again after a very great supplement presented by my colleague Paola Ruggieri. She has focused in her presentation on architectural elements. Now what remains us to do is to answer the last question that we posed. In my presentation, we were trying to stress a few elements that will make us understand what was the past and what is now the present of this garden. But now, what we are striving for, where are we going now? So here, just to be able to put this response in the proper framework, we should be aware of a few things. In this graph that you can see, we see the last 5 years. Of course, 2020 is a very particular year for all of us due to pandemic. Nevertheless, since 2015, from 2015 on to 2019, we can see a growing trend of more and more visitors coming in to the Boboli Garden, and this is a trend which is very significant from our point of view. And as curators of this place, we have to be confronted with very many challenges. These are the challenges that have already been addressed by my colleague Paola Ruggieri. This is connected to knowledge and to this sole fact that this place is becoming more and more open. Therefore, it has to have its proper voice. It has to be able to tell its story, speak its mind, so that this story can be known and learned by the visitors, so that they can go deep into this history. And we should be basing upon an equilibrium between various elements. It shouldn't be just a place to pass through, to run through. It has to be a place to tell events of a political nature, to tell a place that tells events about this rediscovery of culture. It has to be a catalyst for this renewed interest in culture. This place should also serve to raise awareness that collections are objects to be passed through to next generations. And now, the overall result of Galleria Uffizi is something that assumes this task of institutional nature. This is usually a silent spot, because the garden is usually a silent spot. However, it has taken up a series of actions which are connected one with the other. All these actions attempt to reflect all the nuances which are characteristic of this garden. We deeply believe in the meaning of cooperation, interinstitutional cooperation and international cooperation. So this very project at Citri at Aurea served as something very important for us. This is a project that we intended to engage ourselves very quickly, and this exchange of ideas is, from our point of view, priceless. There are all the actions coming to it of dissemination. This is what we do in cooperation with the schools and individual visitors. Within our structures, we've got many departments dealing with the management of the space. Others cope with disseminating the identity of our museums. So this dissemination work is very pivotal, because we all know that schools can be hugely absorbent of our communication. Whatever we sow now, we can have as a crop in the future. Therefore, we have to be acting in a relevant way, we should stay relevant, and we should be rigorous in terms and disciplines in terms of how we treat science, and this science should be the guiding force for all our conservatory interventions. My colleague Paola Ruggieri paid attention to propedeutic actions, research, etc. We should be taking up actions that are not only effective and apparently successfully restoring the proper functionality, these are also to be actions very respectful of the proper identity of this place. There are things which make us go back to the past, what happened to these gardens over the past years. We want for this experience of the visit in a Boboli Garden to be a complete experience. We want it to be remembered keenly. If you are in a garden, you want to stay there. You don't want to escape as soon as possible. And so we have prepared a vast repertoire of services that we provide to our visitors. We want this place to be flexible and to be able to respond to new identities. We want this place to be one that acts in accordance with the spirit of the contemporary times. Here we see the exhibition of the contemporary art, and this contemporary art can add up this very important dimension. We have also activities which make us more open to visitors. Such experiences are immensely valuable in terms of what such visitors ultimately can remember upon such a visit. So knowledge about the Boboli Garden can be also expanded in other places via digital technologies. Uffizi Gallery also takes use of digital tools as a form of communication to communicate with our partners. This is immensely important, and especially these days it has turned out how important it is to have them at hand. So in this context, both the garden and the Uffizi Gallery have managed to take advantage take advantage of the potential of the social media. Here in this slide that you see, we have a handful of examples of experiences and actions that we talk a lot in our team. Now, to bring my speech to a close, I would like to pick up and display before you something that is to me a patron to this garden. This is a very old oak, probably dating back to the plantings of the 17th century. This is not a tree which would be well embedded within the canons of the standardized beauty. It is its structure is not even, and it has assumed the hurting hand of a human, and it comes to symbolize the authenticity of our garden. Moreover, it encourages us to have a reflection of the following content. Beauty is often not ideal. Nevertheless, whenever coming into contact with the beauty, you have to be very tactful, because beauty is fragile. So investing in knowledge that you acquire within such projects as also Citri at Aurea, investing in knowledge that you gain also via conservation works. This kind of investment, thanks to which you can raise collective awareness of the community, which can be then translated into this collective sense of responsibility. Eventually, it can help all of us feel ourselves guardians of this heritage, and this is also the goal that we set for ourselves within the framework of conservation works that we've got in Boboli Gardens. I want our project Citri at Aurea to be able to sow this seed of knowledge, of dialogue, of growth for this cultural heritage that we've been fortunate enough to inherit. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Gianni Simonti. I'm one of the engineers, technicians working in the Boboli Garden. From the perspective of this technical side, I'm responsible for catering for the needs of citrus trees. Within this presentation, I would like to focus on the citrus collection, whose traditions span throughout 470 years. I myself decided for the birth of citruses to be made coincide with the creation and development of the Boboli Garden, upon the request of Cosma III de' Medici and his Cosma I de' Medici and his wife Eleanor of Toledo. Why have I decided to make this tradition of citrus collection overlap with the development of the garden? It is due to the fact that Cosma I here in Boboli continued his iconographic interest, which he brought from other gardens that he owned at Villa Real di Castel, for example. This is where citruses were to come to stand for and symbolize to be of fundamental value for the entire garden. Within what has already been created within Villa Real, we can outline a few elements which are very important. Sculpture and sculpture of statues. Here we see, for example, the statue of Hercules. This and other sculptures were set to glorify the accomplishments of Cosma I de' Medici as the one who had managed to unify the Duchy of Tuscany. This is what was present in the Villa Real. And the story is that the Grand Duke gets impersonified as Hercules combating Antaeus. This is where the virtues of morals, high morale and intelligence comes to be combined with each other. There's yet another myth that is worth mentioning, the myth of Hesperides. This is where the Grand Duke sees himself as the participant of the 11th labor of Hercules. Hercules was supposed to conquer the Hesperides, who themselves come to personify intelligence. Back in the Renaissance times, in Italy, what was commenced was this kind of collection, traditions in collectionisms. Those collections were run by the Medici family, dispersed throughout Tuscany. Citruses were present there too, but coming back to the 11th labor of Hercules, the Hesperides were to come to personify to intelligence on the one hand, on the other hand, they were to symbolize eternal life. There is yet another pivotal aspect from the point of view of collecting citrus trees. We should address the very use and the very possible applications of those trees. They were very of advantage for pharmacology. It was a very interesting aspect since, due to the consumption of citrus fruit, as once believed, one could count on a very long life. Tribolo was tasked with the Grand Duke to set up the cultivation of citrus trees within the Boboli Garden. Now it is a very important element. If we look at the image by Giusto Utens that was developed at the beginning of the 17th century, can win some imagination over how this screenplay looked, involving this vegetal part too. We don't know exactly where these cultivations were run, but we can say that along the avenue there were vases and pots with citruses and citrons. Along another avenue still there was the cultivation of bitter orange. This particular alley then ran into the avenue, heading towards the Madame cave. Cosma I would introduce different cultivations of lemons, citrons, limettes, etc. Those traditions were then passed over to his successors.
Francis I and Ferdinand I, and these collections were even enriched under their reign. The Boboli Garden did not undergo in that period of time very significant transformations. Such transformations came later, involving the change and conversion of the Cyrus collection. Cosmo III requested the development of 3 separate gardens to be devoted to the Cyrus collection. Here we talk about these 3 subsequent gardens called Sughera, that is of the cork oak, lava capo, and the night garden. This is where we can observe the actual heyday of this particular collection. There are also aisle gardens. Within their symbolic value, citruses got most magnified. Now, just to have some imagination perception of where those gardens were located, it's very good to take a look at the Cori topographic plans. This is where we can easily recognize where the gardens in question, tasked by Cosmo II, were located. This is located close to the wall. We speak about 2 gardens, Sughera and Lava Capo. This is where the espaliers of bitter orange were developed, plus other plants, other varieties, be it, for instance, jasmine. It was all enriched by architectural forms that would serve as scaffolding for the bushes of bitter orange, plus there was one small canal discovered later that led from the source and served as the element of the water system. These mosaic of polychromic colors, white, black, and red. That is the aisle garden. This is where the citrus trees were cultivated in vases. They were ordered in a very irregular form in this garden. This is where we see a significant number of vases, of pots, where citruses of most precious value were cultivated. Next, there comes the moment of glory, of heyday, of the citrus trees under the reign of Cosmo III de' Medici, who was passionate about planting and cultivating citruses. In 1715, he tasks Bartolo Bimbi to develop a painting around citruses. On 4 canvas, we can see 170 varieties of citruses belonging to the Grand Duke. By matter of principle, we should rather address 117 specimens. This is not actually 117 varieties, in spite of the fact varieties amounted to more than 100, but these are, as a matter of fact, specimens representatives of on the very frequent occasions, the very same varieties. What was the overarching goal standing behind the very development of this canvas in the first place? It boiled down to dissemination and education. The Grand Duke decided that descriptive names would be placed underneath the canvas in the lower part. This nomenclature was not matched with the official binomial nomenclature that was applied. Under the reign of Cosmo III, on the one hand, we could observe the heyday of the citrus collection, but on the other hand, the period of his reign coincided with the deterioration of the Medici family. Therefore, it became evident that such 4 canvas would be created to pass over this spirit of magnificence. These canvas were aimed at contributing to their greater dissemination of the names of citruses and their subsequent varieties. It is also true that towards the beginning of the 18th century, and we are speaking about this
decadent period of the Medici family, the Habsburg-Lorraine house takes over. The members of this family do not value that highly the magnificence of the citrus collection. Nevertheless, it changes slowly in the second period of their reign, when Peter Leopold comes to the throne. Peter Leopold takes into consideration the revivification of the citrus collection. He embeds it within a larger plan to reconstruct the garden. He puts to life a new lemon house. Now we need to make a quick step back towards the end of the Medici reign. We could observe the use of such places whereby citrus trees would be stored in the winter time. It is worth mentioning what particular structures were used by the members and the staff of the Medici family. Here we had three rooms serving the needs of three gardens. Number one in the area of the Madame Garden, another one in the area of the Night Garden, and the third one that served the collection of citruses that were exhibited on the aisle. These rooms, these capacities were insufficient, according to Peter Leopold. Therefore, he makes a decision for this lemon house to come into being. The construction is concluded in 1787. The difference of this lemon house, and that was developed under the Lorraine Habsburg reign, when we compare it to the structures of the Medici times, we see that this newer garden also exemplifies decorative elements, embellishments. Now we see that these rooms under the Medici times, be it, for instance, this great lemon house of Villarreal, these are devoid of any emblems of identity. These are rather anonymous beings, whereas these newer structures, which we can see in next slides, here, a project of 1787. This is where we see that this great Grand Duke wanted to accentuate this grandeur by architectural form accompanying the citrus collections. Moving on, we see the present outlook over the great lemon house. Together there is another lemon house at the back of it, whereby a part of the historic collection is also stored. These structures come under the stewardship, which is very diligent. So it was in 18th century, it was also the case in the 19th century, in the period of reunification of Italy. It is so now too, and also it was so during the time of passing the rule from the duchy family of dukes to the royal family of Savoy. Two world wars shattered the collection of citruses, as it was connected with lower care that was taken vis-à-vis these collections by the greatest hit was due to the flooding of Florence, which took place in 1966. At this time, we see the switch from a storage function to the drying room for survived works of art. Back then, citrus collection was stored either in the exteriors or within the Palazzo Pitti. Many losses were incurred either due to the lack of experience of those taking care of the citrus collection or just weather conditions, be it frost. But here we see what is one of the distinguishing features of these plants. They are characterized by a great vitality. Thanks to this, many specimens could be rebuilt. Those very plants started
growing from beneath the point, the point of crossing. Therefore, we could make these plants live again. This is one specimen that got destroyed in 1966, bitter orange, and this bitter orange, as it was cut off one day, but now this specimen deals with works very nicely. It is exhibited within the Isle Garden. Now moving on to contemporary times. Within the time in which this citrus collection was under the administration of the Poly Museum Directorate, now is under the stewardship of the Uffizi, let me show you one slide. This slide is very representative of what this garden looks like now and how we can compare it to the historic representations by Gori. What we see here, we see many historic superimpositions, many overlappings. There is huge transformation to the original shape. There are no so-called ranias. There are no green labyrinths at all. Many areas underwent remarkable transformations. They would be once, they used to be Italian gardens, and they are rather English gardens now. These Medici gardens have some features that we need to take note of, namely the citrus collection from 1550 up till now can be characterized by a relative richness in terms of how many varieties there are. We see very diversified specimens, varieties, etc. The rooms, the structures that we were talking about, the function has changed slightly. This lemon house very much serves the purposes of storage, but there is also the role to be played by the tepidarium. We've got here around 500 pots, which get stored in the winter time, and thanks to this we can conserve as many as 60 varieties, which constitute the core of our collection. 30 of them may be dating back to the collections of the Medici family. In the next slides we can see the interiors of the lemon house, and these pictures can be juxtaposed to this original outlook over the insides of the lemon house. In the past, this room would be of clay pavement. It was paved in clay, which played to the benefit of maintaining a kind of microclimate in the insides. But as it was changed in 1966, the whole pavement rebuilt in concrete, now we experience certain problems regarding the maintenance of temperature and humidity. Under the Lorraine Habsburg house, this lemon house demanded to be heated. Back then what was applied were wood-burning stoves. These days we rather use convector ovens. This is not a sole innovation that has been introduced. Truth to be told, in the past we would use such bits of equipment, such lifts. Now it has got substituted by different devices and pieces of equipment that serve to move the pots and vases. To bring my speech to a close, I would like to draw your attention to a few aspects which I find very important. It's important to know the history, because knowing history we can better serve the Medici collection. This collection was rich as it very much relied on exchanges. There's varieties, the magnitude of varieties was down not only to acquiring plants elsewhere in the country or from abroad. It was not only down to the internal evolution. It could be so thanks to the exchange in between different courts. This citrus mania was a distinguishing feature both of the Renaissance and the Baroque period. Grand dukes would exchange their specimens with the representatives of other European courts. Such exchanges were also very important for Cosmo III de' Medici, as well as for the Polish king Jan III. They exchange correspondence, as we can see here in the slide. Jan III requested the Grand Duke to submit a list of varieties plus guidelines for cultivation so that he can also have these specimens and varieties cultivated in his residence in Wilanów. And so this whole list is starts with Pomo Dada. It was then verified by which was believed to be a variety of apple. Then it was corrected by Cosmo III. First mentions of this variety can be traced back to Marco Polo travels to Persia, the contemporary Iran. The crossings were created by the Arabs in the Palestinian territory. Later, these crossings came into the cultivation in Europe. This Pom Dada finds its place in the citrus collection of the ruling families in Europe. In the Boboli Garden, we've got both varieties characterized with this smooth fruit and with this wrinkled fruit. Here we see different representations of Ferrari, Fullhammer, as well as Bimbi. This fruit was very encircled. And now, when I was reviewing the materials, so that I can tell you something, my colleagues from Wilanów, in this partnership, I was hit by a fresco from the chapel of Eleanor of Toledo from the Palazzo Vecchio, and under one herb at his feet we see the representation of this particular fruit with encircled fruit, and now it does blossom very nicely in our collection of the Boboli Garden. This is one of the varieties which, as I believe, was sent by Cosmo III de' Medici to the King Jan III Sobieski. Towards the end of my presentation, I would like to express my gratitude in the first place to my colleague Galeotti, who has passed over to me his passion for the citrus cultivation. He also shared much knowledge with me. Architect Kapenki, I feel grateful for all the materials you have provided me with. And for sure, I would like to express my gratitude vis-à-vis our dear colleagues from Wilanów, the entire personnel that made this event come true. Thank you. There are myths and legends associated with each historical collection, and this is, of course, the case with the Nieborów collection. That is, how much truth is there in the legend? The collection of citrus trees, known as the Nieborów collection, is one of the most famous collections of exotic plants in Central Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. Its history connects the Saxon city of Dresden, the intercultural Nieborów, and the Russified Warsaw, and is in itself full of many dramatic episodes. The collection dates back to the first years of the 18th century, when the King of Saxony, August II the Strong, enchanted by the beauty of Anna Hoym, later Countess Kossel, built palaces for her and embellished gardens with orange trees. And this is how the famous garden of the Hesperides was created in the courtyard of the constantly expanded Zwinger Palace. decorated with the custom and taste of the century. In the quarters there are flowers planted with boxwood, with fountains, caves, and ornaments rich in methodological figures. Orange groves arranged from trees. The king reportedly gathered about 4,000 orange trees in his collection. King August the Strong, known for his sensitivity to the fair sex, felt equal weakness towards citrus trees, which he accumulated until the end of his life. Józef Ignacy Kraszewski, in the pages of his novel entitled The Countess Kozel, reports that in 1733 the king sent a scientific expedition to Africa, where, as ballast, 400 felled orange trees were thrown into the ship to be used for turning. After the expedition returned to Dresden, the trees were planted, and reportedly most of them came to life. And here is the first myth or the truth. The above-mentioned 4,000 trees adorned many gardens of Saxon residences, not only royal ones, of course, in Pilnitz, Grossedlitz, Bad Muskau. In some of them, this tradition is still maintained today. August the Strong's love for Anna Kozel lasted only a few years. Then the countess was imprisoned for 49 years in Stolpen Castle. After the king's death, the Zwinger's collection of citrus trees was probably inherited by the daughter of August and Anna Kozel, Frederick, wife of treasurer Frederick Christian Moszyński. This collection remained in the hands of the Moszyński family until the end of the 18th century, and this was when the Polish duchess Helena Radziwiłłowa, wife of the last Vilnius voivode Michał Hieronim Radziwiłł, desired to buy it back. The duchess was quite determined collector of ancient art. For over a dozen years, Arcadia Park was being created under her watchful and demanding eye. It was a mythical, idyllic, sentimental, romantic, but above all, an ancient land in which citrus trees would look great. The negotiations lasted for many months, and finally Jan Kortonowski, the marshal of the court of the Radziwiłł dukes, came to Dresden on rafts. Orangery Moszczański, because that is what Michał Piotr Radziwiłł calls it in his book devoted to Helena Radziwiłłowa, the last Vilnius voivode, was bought for 35,000 zlotys. Florins, or according to another source, 300,000 ducats. The duchess had to somehow compensate for the high price paid by the Radziwiłł family. So she cleverly planned the transport of trees to Nieborów. That for many decades the story of this event circulated in Berlin. As mentioned above, the name Kortonowski, a trusted court marshal, and for the duration of the escapade called Admiral, came to Dresden. Due to the size of the trees, around 4 or 5 meters high, together with the pot and the crown, and their number, about 300, transport could only take place by water. On May evening in 1785, the Duchy of Radziwiłł visited Beloew Castle, which belonged to August Frederick Hohenzollern, younger brother of the ruling king of Prussia, Frederick William II. It was a courtesy visit in connection with the planned marriage of their son Antoni and the daughter of the Duke of Hohenzollern, Louisa. And so, after lunch, a large group of guests began to spread out on the garden terraces above the Spree river, when the sudden cry of voivode daughter standing by the window gathered the curious people. The duchess was pointing towards the river. It was all described by Michał Piotr Radziwiłł. Of course, along the river, amid the sounds of music, a flotilla of rafts, with Admiral Kortonowski at the helm, spread around the wonderful scent of orange blossom illuminated by Venetian lamps. This is how Duchess Helena has already presented her orangery. It goes beyond any doubt that, wanting to impress the Hohenzollern and the future father-in-law of her son, Antoni, she invited all the guests to the party on the rafts. The next day the flotilla sailed further down the Spree to reach Gdańsk. We do not know whether it was further along the Havel and the sea or through some canals, many of which were already built in Pomerania. Then they sailed from Gdańsk to Wyszogród on the Vistula River against the current, near
the town of Wrocław, the prince had his port in Pieczyska. Both the literature and the documents collected in the archives are silent about the way of transporting trees from the port to Nieborów. Was it still on the Bzura River? And would it allow us to get 8 kilometers closer to Nieborów? Or was it from Wyszogród, and these several dozen kilometers were carried out on some special carts? Unfortunately, we don't know that. In order for this wonderful collection to be displayed in Nieborów, Duke Michał Hieronim had to build a new, second, much larger orangery. This is the design of the first orangery, and this orangery had not been rebuilt, amplified anymore, and it still exists in only 2 such parts. And this is the design of the second orangery, the construction of which was commissioned by the same architect, Szymon Bogumił Cuk, and the resulting structure was 357 feet long, 23 feet wide and 23 feet high, and 1 foot of the new point measure is equivalent to 0.228 meters. A delicious Tuscan colonnade on the south facade adorned this new orangery. Having 2 beautiful conservatories at their disposal, the collection also includes a part of the former collection of the Lubomirski family from Wilanów. This collection was bought back from its next owner, Prussian diplomat Ludwig Heinrich Buchholz. Buchholz, when leaving Warsaw, was simply not able to take her back to Poznań, and this is how these impressive grenades, laurels, and myrtles were delivered to Nieborów, and I'm going to show it to you. Those beautiful trees. And this is, for instance, the pomegranate tree, which Jan Wagner titled Nieborów, and is signed as a pomegranate tree from the collection of Marysinka Sobieska. So this is this little thread that perhaps connects us with Wilanów. And in total, this Nieborów collection consisted of about 370 plants. Of course, this number was different every year because it is a living material and is subject as such to the inexorable laws of nature. And the aforementioned inventory from 1814 informs us that there were 275 orange trees, 36 lemon trees, and 6 so-called Adam's apples. Moreover, magnolias, royals, camphor trees, laurel trees, myrtles, cypresses. In 1824, sweet and bitter oranges, 286 lemons, 35 pomme d'Adam, 6 pomegranates, 16. And these are Wilanów pomegranates. In 1833, trees were valued, and their age was estimated. And so, orange trees about 300 years old in demand of 5, about 250 years, 20, 39 100-year-olds and 8 100-year-old grenades. On one of the lemon trees back in 1901 there was a metal plate with the inscription, "I was born in Palermo, moved to Saxony for the play of the king. Turner. I matured under a different sky. At the beginning of the 20th century, I count the lives of 8 centuries, with the date January the 1st, 1901. This plate, of course, is lost, and this bush and this blade are no longer with us. We repeat the information only after Jan Wegner, and he in turn after the information obtained from the Krasiński library, which we cannot check either, as most of this collection was burned down during World War II. And this information about trees growing in Sicily, does it have anything to do with Elia's scientific expedition to Africa? Perhaps it was in Sicily that these big trees were loaded. And here I'm puzzled by this mention of the King Turner, and it was brought to the turning hands. This entire collection in Nieborów was about 74 years. old at that time. It was described by many visitors to Nieborów in many memoirs, diaries, travel letters. For example, Klemena Hoffman writes in her fifth volume of works, but the orangery visitors to Nieborów are most puzzled. Our Polish one is not similar. It is difficult to find a more beautiful one in Germany. There are over 200 pieces of orange lemon trees. Some of them are 350 years old, and they are as thick as an adult man. They spend several dozen feet of lemons and sweet oranges each year, even more bitter. Konstancja Biernacka, in traveling from Włodawa to Gdańsk, also mentions without an equal greenhouse in which a cypress tree was grown taller than the Nieborowski Palace in Warsaw, 10 feet tall. The condition of the collection was supervised by gardeners, be them Renz, Johann Daniel Techner, Konrad Karol Franke, Antoni Schmidt, Dominik Jasiński, Leopold Jon, Wacław Czermach, Felix Kołaczkowski, Foky, Józef Borecki, Komendant Jan Waniaszku. The greatest merits are attributed to Leopold Jon. Czech, about whom Piotr Hozer wrote, "It seems, however, that old Jon in Nieborów was the love gardener who knew how to grow oranges. He knew every tree, talked to him, wrote on a bucket with chalk how many buckets of water are to be received."
Posiadał zawsze obfity zapas odpowiedniego kompostu. Skutek tego drzewa były tak piękne,
As a result of his actions, the trees were so beautiful that in fact they could not be more beautiful, and as trees in buckets they were probably the most beautiful in the world. Hozer has repeatedly put Jon as a model of garden. Jon in Nieborów, who will hardly get enough sleep as long as he does not neglect the oranges. But most of all, Leopold Jon, a descendant of a gardener from Karlsbad, and a brother of the master of Polish fruit farming, carefully kept his secret, a recipe for soil for oranges and lemons. This secret was revealed only several decades later by his student Felix Kołaczkowski, who successfully used it himself in his gardening career. We have been introducing these substrates to our crops for the last 2 years. How valuable this orangery was for Duchess Helena Radziwiłł and her spouse can be proved by the fact that in their will they reserved the collections indivisibility and inalienability. However, in 1858, the daughter-in-law of Duchess Helena Aleksandra Ostecka began negotiations with the representative of the Imperial Palace's board, Lieutenant General Ignacy Abramowicz, which resulted in division of the collection and the sale of its better part to Tsar Alexander II. And a strange thing happened, as the collection was sold in 1858, but for 12 years it stayed in Nieborów. Its maintenance was provided by the administration of imperial palaces, so it's called Eat a Cake and Have a Cake. This collection remained in Nieborów for another 12 years. Although Duchess Alexandra died soon, her son Zygmunt generously shared the orangery building and agreed to leave the sold trees in Nieborów, and he generously agreed, of course, until a new orangery was built in Łazienki. Incidentally, it should be added that the orangery in Nieborów was in a very bad condition and so required many renovations. In the archives of the Palace Board Imperial, now in the Central Archives of Historical Records, bills for the renovation of heating channels, roof windows, and new orange tree buckets, for example, 41 rubles for 41 buckets, have been preserved. Bills for the renovation of heating channels and gardeners had to care for plants have been preserved. Already in 1858, Jan Waniaszek was delegated to Nieborów, a gardener from the Czech Republic who had excellent references, among others from the Liechtenstein Orangery, from Horka and the gardens of Prague. After many years spent in Nieborów looking after the imperial orangery, he was taken to Łazienki, together with trees, and soon became a gardener. In Ogrodnik Polski it was written that the orange trees he cultivated are both the pride of Warsaw and an excellent testimony to the gardener who cares for them. 1805 accepted Russian serfdom in the orangery of Nieborów, apart from the exquisite specimens sold to the Tsar.
there were also specimens that were to remain in Nieborów. They were uglier, smaller, sick. These trees were looked after by the gardeners of Duke Zygmunt. Leopold Jon unfortunately died in April 1858, or was it just a coincidence? Even though Jose called him Old Jon, he was only in his 50s, so we suspect that perhaps the news of his willingness to sell the collection helped him a little bit with his death. In 1861, Józef Borecki, a young gardener who had been working in Arcadia for several years, was transferred to Nieborów, and perhaps it was he who looked after the oranges that were transported to Arcadia for the summer in the amount of about 100. In 1865, he became the chief gardener in Nieborów, and in the report, which was presented by the Honourable Administration, he writes, point 83, a sick orange was brought to life almost without leaves for 8 years. Point 39, all the smaller lemons and oranges have been exaggerated and brought to full health. Today they have covered themselves with fresh, good paint and a leaf, and a flower, and even some fruit. After many years of preparations on the part of the new owners, and finally in 1869, 3 orange trees were transported by train from Łódź to Warsaw for trial. It required special wagons and cranes. Here are some pictures that show you all the machines used for this transport. It was undertaken by the company of the Greenbaum brothers, which a year later carried out a heroic work of transporting the 70 largest trees from Nieborów to Warsaw. The route of this passage was carefully marked out. 1 tree was loaded per wagon. All the stops and the time the journey was supposed to take were carefully calculated, and the Greenbaum family still had to pay a deposit for the duration of this adventure. A very detailed contract was concluded, and this may serve as an example of how to conclude such a contract, and this contract amounted to 1,742 rubles. The venture lasted from May the 22nd to June the 25th, 1870. The remaining smaller trees were transported by rail. The collection was sold with 228 rubles. Of the trees remaining in Nieborów, the last specimens survived until 1981. This is the orangery in Łazienki. These are the specimens that ended up in Łazienki. Here we have a few photos from Nieborów, so you can see that the much younger ones stayed in Nieborów. This is the Wilanów pomegranate. It is probably the oldest orange tree. It lived to see 1981. Such was the decor interbellum period of our flower floor. This is what the orangery looked like. Unfortunately, you can't see this slide, but in fact you can see these huge trees inside, and it's spring 1935, and this is what the orangery looks like after the fire. All plants died in the fire. Basically, 1 thick tree survived, which was not damaged by either the freezing water from the fire extinguishing or by the frost which had caught the plant outside. So much is left. So much is left of our wonderful collection. This is a new orangery, which was pulled down after the collection was sold. Only a small fragment of it is left. This fragment served as a barn lamp for many years. In the 1950s, its windows were restored, and the interior was restored a few years ago. It is unarmed, there is no water there, there is no floor. There are basically only walls, windows and electricity. Still, we use it, and it serves us in the summer as an interior with where you can have your coffee, where you can have some rest. Thank you very much. Orangeries of Łazienki Królewskie, facts and legends about collections of citrus plants.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the presented material I will briefly outline the figure of the founder of Łazienki, the history of the garden and orangeries, that is, objects in which we store citrus plants in winter and which serve to embellish the garden in the summer. The creator and founder of the Łazienki Królewskie was the last Polish king, who reigned in 1764-1795. A very well-educated king with extraordinary political intuition, aware of the need for changes. He surrounded himself with enlightened people. He followed fashion and news from Europe and introduced them in Poland. His great passion and work of life was the Łazienki Garden, established in a unique style called Stanisławowski. It was a classicist style with elements of Baroque. The king picked up the best of the contemporary garden fashion and combined it in the palace and garden concept of Łazienki. Currently, there are 3 garden styles in the garden. And we come across 3 styles in the garden art. It is 17th-18th century, the oldest royal garden and English garden with regular remnants of the Baroque period, the 19th century romantic garden in the style of English landscape gardens, and finally the 20th century modernist garden, the geometric and naturalistic style. The water system is the basis of the entire garden layout, along with a system of roads and paths, as well as the well-composed arrangement of trees and shrubs, creating interiors and beautiful long viewing axes. This is what the area of the Vistula embankment looked like in the middle of the 18th century, in the times of Stanisław August, when, as Stanisław Antoni Poniatowski was not the king then, he bought the Ujazdowski castle from the Lubomirski, along with the area of the zoo and pavilions for rest after hunting. The village of Ujazdów, meadows, fields stretching at the foot of the escarpment towards Wilanów. Plan of Łazienki with the location of the orangery. We find the first records of this area in the 11th century. However, the history of the foundation dates back to the Ujazdowski castle, which was erected on a slope. Located in a perfect scenic and defensive location, it was originally planned as the seat of the ruler. As numerous reconstructions do not bring the expected results, the king's interest is directed towards the pavilions. One of the pavilions, one is the Hermitage and the other is so-called Bath, which after reconstruction turns into a palace, into the summer residence, the palace on the Isle. The first orangery to be built in the Royal Park is the Old Orangery. It was originally called the Great Orangery. It is the only orangery established during the king's reign, established in 1788, and its designer was Dominic Merlini, the favorite royal architect. Then, the second orangery in this palace and garden complex is the Neo-Gothic Orangery. This was created in the 19th century, in the so-called Tsarist period. In 1822, the Neo-Gothic Orangery was developed. It was designed by Jakub Kubicki, a student of a mentee of Dominic Merlini. Then, in 1860, the new orangery, designed by architects Adam Löw and Józef Orłowski, was created, and in 1870, the famous orangery called Nieborowska, designed by the architect Krakow, came into being. The entire 20th century passes, and it is only in the 21st century that the new palm house is created, and this is where we currently store our citrus plants. Actually, this is how the escarpment and the garden changed during the work on the Royal Park of Łazienki. The old orangery is being built with a royal theatre and an orangery garden at the foot of the escarpment. After the resettlement of the village of Ujazdów to the new village. Before that, the White House is being built, palace on the Isle. At the top of the carp there is Belvedere Palace, with one of the most scenic viewing axes in the garden. Here you can see the remains of the village of Ujazdów, a beautiful long viewing axe towards Mokotów, towards Królikarnia, towards the church in Czerniaków,
and towards the Wilanów meadows, with all the alleys leading all the way up to Wilanów itself. This is what the orangery looked like at the beginning of its foundation. It was built in the classical style. From the south, the actual facade has one story with 17 axes. It is low, very stretched, uniform, composed of semicircularly closed windows, doors separated by pillars. Such architecture is evocative of Versailles. The interior was adapted to storing trees in winter, and the Orangery Garden with a terrace was used to display cypresses in the summer. This is what the Great Orangery looked like during the German occupation of 1945, and so after a general renovation both of the building and after the restoration of the garden itself. The old orangery houses the Royal Theatre, located in the eastern part of the building, one of the few original 18th century court theatres in Europe, which since 2015 has been located on the European Baltic Route of Historic Theatres. The old orangery also accommodates the Royal Sculpture Gallery, with a collection of marble, statues and plaster copies of the most important ancient modern works. There is also a polysculpture gallery. This is what the interiors of the orangery itself looked like before the general renovation. We see the walls painted green, an earthy and gravel surface, and under this surface there were heat channels that would supply heat to the orangery in the winter season. And this is what this orangery looks like after a general renovation. And please imagine now that original frescoes designed by Jan Christian Kamzec under these layers of paint. And until now, it had been thought that these murals were only designs. And during the actual restoration works, they were discovered and restored exactly as they were designed by the royal architect. The Orangery Garden has also undergone a major reconstruction. The layout of the garden plots, made in accordance with the revalorization project, was changed after the quarries and historical research were carried out. Drainage and new mineral surfaces were made. The selection of plant species changed. Automatic irrigation of greenery was set up, and later perennial beds were established on lawns. One thing has stayed intact. Every year, from the end of May to October, trees from the orangery are brought into this garden, and they come here to decorate this garden as well as the new orangery. Now, a few interesting facts about this period and this orangery. As there was no orangery in the royal castle, the orangery plants were probably brought for safekeeping to the orangery in Łazienki Królewskie. Sources say that not only castle plants were kept here, but also orangery trees and shrubs from Jabłonna and from Na Książęcym garden, from the gardens of the king's brothers. The inventory made in 1781 lists in the orangery Wielka, Great Orangery, oranges, lemons, myrtles, lorries, pomegranates, and very fashionable at that time, primroses of various varieties. The same inventory, made in 1781, gives the devices with which orangery trees were tended. And these were, for instance, iron hooks for carrying trees from the orangery, and a wooden elevator forged with iron for transplanting trees from the orangery. It may indirectly prove that the trees in the orangery were magnificent. The estimate of the royal property from 1786 states that the trees and plants in the orangery were worth 6,309 ducats. If converted into the currency introduced by States of August, it was 113,562 Polish zlotys. Estimating for today, it would be over 3,340,000 PLN. So the cost of the collection, which was kept in the old orangery by Stanisław August, was indeed significant. This is what the garden looked like after the revalorization, after the renovation spring 2016 and this summer. Another orangery in the Łazienki Garden is the Neo-Gothic Orangery, and as I said, it was developed in 1822 upon the design by Jakub Kubicki. This is already the Tsarist period that we are maneuvering in. The Tsar buys Łazienki Królewskie from the heirs of Stanisław August. The Tsar's brother Konstanty Romanov takes the Belvedere Palace as his seat, and so he begins rebuilding other structures in the Royal Łazienki Park. This orangery is being built in 1822. In 1825, the Egyptian temple, which serves as a fig house, and in 1828, a pineapple plant was built in the botanical garden. All facilities were designed by Jakub Kubicki. Neo-Gothic Orangery did not last for long. It was of weak construction. The foundations were weak. Thus, it was dismantled, and so it was dismantled in 1862. After a scan of the area, its ruins were discovered. After the archaeological work was done, these ruins were discovered and secured. And now, in the garden, we can admire the foundations and walls of the Neo-Gothic Orangery, and so much is left of her beautiful appearance, which I will recall was, I haven't said that actually, was in the Gothic style. It had brick elevations, windows with sharp arches, and decorative battlements modelled on Gothic defensive structures. As you can see, the drawing shows a very impressive object with an arranged garden in front of it, near the Belvedere Pond. The next orangery, which replaced the Neo-Gothic Orangery, was the New Orangery. As gardeners had previously reported that the Neo-Gothic Orangery was in a very bad condition, this one was built in 1860, before the Neo-Gothic Orangery was demolished. From the south, the glazed facade provided the plants with free access to sunlight and solar heat. The middle part was decorated with 18th century statues of Vertemnus and Pomona, i.e. a mythological pair of lovers, deities associated with changes of seasons, gardens and fruit trees. The orangery was also called Italian, so all the decoration is related to the garden and the cultivation of ornamental trees. At the beginning of the 21st century, the new orangery is undergoing a major renovation. It ceases to function as an orangery. Since then, it has housed a restaurant. And the photo on the left shows what the interior of this restaurant actually looks like. And now we move on to the next orangery. This one was established in 1869. Its construction, this is when its construction began. It was specifically built to store the Nieborów collection in this venue of Łazienki. And here I will take over from Mrs. Agnieszka Chmielewska from Nieborów, who told you how it happened that such a valuable collection from the Dresden Zwinger went to Poland, to the town of Nieborów, and then it arrived to Łazienki. In 1858, the management of the Tsar's palaces buys the administration of the Tsar's palaces buys the entire collection from the Radziwiłłs of Nieborów for 280,000 rubles. So it is almost 1,900,000 Polish zlotys. So let me remind you that the collection of Stanisław August cost 113,000. The Nieborów collection is 1,900,000. The cost of transporting the entire collection to St. Petersburg was so significant that the Tsar decided not to transport the collection whatsoever. Therefore, for 25 years it was placed in the Łazienki Park. There are legends circulating about the wonderful smell that would spread and about the size of the plant that had been stored here. Probably some of the trees were like a grown man. They were fat. In waste, the smell spread throughout the neighborhood. The photo shows the location plan of this orangery, together with there is also a contemporary photo. It was located in between the new orangery and today's modernist garden. As a guide to Warsaw from 1893 states, the park is worthy of attention. The new orangery, 200 feet long, consisting of one nave, glazed from the south. It receives the necessary heat by means of an iron pipe from which others go and distribute the hot water. This greenhouse was built on 103 giant orange trees, the only ones of this kind in Europe, 70 of which are between 400 and 600 years old. Nevertheless, the specimen of the camphor tree, the tall large-leaved magnolias, the large number of huge myrtles, granates, cypresses, etc. are huge and old. There is very scant material on the orangery itself. This is the only one that I managed to find. Now, orangery after 45 years, in 1915, during the turmoil, the Tsarist troops leaving Warsaw, the Prussian troops entering, they simply forgot to fire the garden and did not manage. In a word, during the cold winter of 1915, the entire priceless collection freezes, and so it is lost. Since the orangery building was in a very poor condition, after regaining independence by Poland, the building was eventually pulled down. In the 21st century, in 2016, the construction of the new Palm House began. It is already a modern orangery. Half of it is conservatory and half of it is set for educational purposes. Here, nowadays, the Łazienki Park stores its resources of exotic trees and plants. Now Łazienki owns 36 citrus trees, including mandarins, bitter oranges, lemons, kumquats, and 24 European olive trees. This is what our collection looks like in the wintertime in the new Palm House as it was stored. And as you can see, almost all the plants are already in new pots. Those pots were designed and made according to the research, in accordance with the drawings by Zygmunt Vogel. In 2018, all the citrus trees were transplanted into these new pots. Thank you very much for your attention, and I invite you here to visit the Royal Park of Łazienki.